Fred had spent his entire life building a home. But when his own daughter stood at the door, threatening to take away what he valued most, everything changed in an instant. Will this man continue to live in sacrifice? Or will he rediscover himself after years of living for others? A life-altering decision will lead him on a journey that not only changes his life, but also transforms the way he perceives love and self-respect. Watch as Fred confronts the challenges when the house is no longer his, and all he has left is one thing: himself. Fred sat silently in the armchair, the spot he had occupied 1,000 times over the years of happiness with his wife and daughter. The spacious living room, with its pale yellow walls and classical furniture, no longer held the warmth of happy memories, but only faint traces of a time gone by. The whole house seemed to be closing in, like a book that had been shut, its pages turned, with no way to return. The sunset light, once beautiful and gentle, now appeared faded and meaningless as it fell upon the family pictures on the wall. The framed photos, where Fred and his wife had once laughed together, holding hands on peaceful afternoons, now stood as mere remnants of the past. In those pictures, his wife had always smiled, her eyes full of love and hope, but now, that look was gone. The feeling of it was like a lingering wound, seeping into every cell of Fred's body, an emptiness that could not be shaken off. Every sound, no matter how small, in this house, startled him. The wind blowing through the window, the leaves falling on the yard, everything sounded like a sigh from a bygone time. Fred sighed, his eyes following the faint light of the dying day. Waves gently lapped against the shore of the lake outside, but within him, there were no waves, only stillness. Everything was too quiet, too still to face the reality he had just received in a phone call. The phone on the table suddenly rang, as if tearing through the thoughts in his mind. Fred looked at the screen, the light from the phone illuminating his face, reflecting the wrinkles that had begun to form on his forehead. It was Kelly, his daughter. He didn't know what to feel, but one thing was certain. His heart tightened when he saw her name on the screen. Why her? Why his daughter, the one he had given all his love and sacrifices to? From the moment she was born, Fred had nurtured dreams and hoped that one day she would be his pride. And now, those hopes were like a dark cloud, weighing down on his heart. With a slow motion, Fred picked up the phone. Kelly's voice came through, but it was not the voice of the girl he had known. There was no sweetness, no concern, just coldness, a hardness that was almost unbearable. "Dad, this house doesn't belong to you anymore." Kelly's words did not feel like an announcement. They felt like a sentence, a punch to the face. It felt as if everything around him had suddenly stopped. Time, space, everything was frozen in that moment. Fred stood frozen, unable to utter a word. It wasn't anger, it wasn't surprise, only emptiness, an inability to believe it. He had spent his whole life building a home, creating a sanctuary for his family, and now, his own daughter was rejecting it all. A part of him wanted to shout, to argue against what she said, but another part couldn't. The feeling of helplessness and loneliness grew stronger. The years he had devoted to his family, the endless efforts he had put into creating a good life for his wife and daughter, now seemed meaningless. Kelly had taken everything, not with violence or deceit, but with a simple sentence: "This house doesn't belong to you anymore." A cold, unfeeling statement. Fred looked at the phone screen, but he couldn't see anything anymore. His vision blurred, and memories flooded his mind like a whirlwind. He remembered the days when his wife was still alive, when they moved in together, dreaming of a happy family. They had arranged every room together, imagining a bright future. And now, all that remained were old pictures, empty chairs, and faded family photos on the wall. A part of him still couldn't accept this reality. How could this be? How could a father be rejected by his own daughter? Fred remembered the evenings when the family sat together at the dinner table. Warm dinners, where his wife and daughter shared stories, their joys and sorrows. Now, Those moments seemed so far away, impossible to return to. Fred put the phone down on the table. A soft click echoed in the quiet room. He stood up, slowly walking to the window. The light outside had dimmed, and the space was growing darker. He looked out at the lake, where gentle waves lapped against the shore. Each wave seemed like a reminder of life's impermanence, of time that couldn't be turned back. Yellow leaves floated on the water, like memories that had passed, unreachable. Fred felt as though he were standing on the edge, as if the whole world had turned its back on him. The memories of his wife, of the happy days, now felt like wounds in his heart. Everything in this house had changed, and he was no longer the man he once was. He had lost his wife, now his daughter, and the house he had poured so much love and hope into no longer belonged to him. A gentle breeze blew through, but it couldn't dispel the pain in his heart. Fred stood there, silent, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. Everything had changed. This house no longer belonged to him, and Kelly was no longer the daughter he had once loved. All he had now was a void, a wound that could never heal. Fred's mansion, once the place where all family memories were preserved, now stood empty and silent, much like a ruined castle in the vast sea. The spacious living room, where the whole family had once gathered together on warm evenings, now only held the traces of time. Empty sofas, tables, and paintings on the wall that had gradually faded, as if they were sighing for a past that could never be returned to. Fred sat there, in the armchair, the light from the window casting over his face, but it was not enough to soothe the numbness in his heart. He gazed out the window, where the fading sunset light still dimmed on the surface of the lake. The scenery outside remained peaceful, calm as though unchanged, but within him a storm was swirling, a storm that he could not explain. This house, the one he had spent his life building, had suddenly become an unhealable pain. Kelly's words, "This house doesn't belong to you anymore," echoed in his mind, like an explosion in his chest, tearing apart everything he once believed in. He recalled every corner of this house. The entire house wasn't just a place to live. It was filled with memories, with sweat and tears from him and his wife. Together, they had built each brick, each column, each wall. Every object in the house was a part of the love and hope that he and his wife had created together. The family photos hanging on the wall, the 2 chairs where he and his wife would sit together every evening, had become symbols of love, of connection. But now, this house had become a part of the past, like a book that had been turned and could not be turned back to its first page. Fred looked again at the phone on the table, its screen still lit with Kelly's name. But he couldn't bring himself to pick up the phone. Her words still rang in his mind, like a sharp knife, not giving him time to think or react. He felt as though he had been ruthlessly stripped of everything he had, but the more he thought, the more the unspoken questions surged. Why had Kelly done this? How could she treat him this way? How could the one person he had sacrificed his entire life for turn her back and cast away everything he had built? That question kept repeating in his mind, like an obsession, with no answer. Everything had changed, but why her? Why his daughter, the one he had trusted, would inherit everything he had created? How could she not understand that this house was not just a material possession, but all the memories, dreams, and love he had poured into it? In the empty space, a voice arose, soft yet profound, as if someone were peering into his soul, touching the deepest corners. That voice wasn't from anyone else. It was Fred's own voice, a voice he had not recognized before, but now seemed like a reminder, a warning about everything he had been through. If you spend your whole life building a home, and one day your own daughter wants to take it from you, what would you do? The question resonated in the stillness, with no urgency or reproach, only a gentle inquiry. The voice seemed to capture all of his emotions, the unspoken pains, the thoughts he had never expressed. The question was like a mirror, forcing Fred to confront himself, to face a truth he could not deny. This house, which he had built with so much hope, had suddenly been taken from him gently, like the wind sweeping away the golden leaves in autumn. Everything he had tried, everything he had sacrificed, had suddenly become meaningless in his daughter's eyes. He recalled the early days when he and his wife first moved in here. They dreamed of a warm family, where love would surround everything, where their children would grow up and carry on the values they had nurtured. But now, that dream had shattered. Kelly, the daughter he had given all his love and sacrifice to, had thrown it all away. Everything seemed to have changed in ways he could not comprehend. There were times when he wondered if he had made a mistake somewhere, whether he had spoiled Kelly too much, had created an invisible gap between them, and whether he had trusted her love too much to notice the changes in her long ago. The voice continued, softly but deeply moving. There are some stories that never have a perfect ending. Fred, sometimes the home you spent your life building is torn apart by changes you cannot control, and sometimes you have to accept that a story doesn't always end the way you hoped. Fred gently closed his eyes, the words flowing over him like a wave, sweeping away every thought. Perhaps, in this life, not every story can reach a beautiful conclusion. This house, the home that he and his wife had built together, no longer belonged to him. And Kelly, the daughter he had loved and sacrificed for, was now the one tearing apart those dreams. But the truth remained the truth, and he had to learn to accept it. The narrator's voice continued softly, like a comforting yet profound reminder. You may lose the house, but you will never lose yourself. The home may no longer exist, but the memories, the values you lived by, will forever remain in your heart. And sometimes, loss is the way we find ourselves again. Fred sat still, his eyes fixed on the family photo on the wall, where he, his wife, and Kelly were all smiling brightly. He could not change the past, could not return to those days, but he could learn to accept. After all, he was still Fred, the man who had built all of this, even though, in the end, this house no longer belonged to him. A quiet sorrow welled up in Fred's heart, but there was also a sense of relief, as if he had found something of himself. His story didn't end here, and perhaps he would be the one to continue writing it. No matter how many challenges or losses awaited him, Fred sat silently on the porch, holding a cold cup of coffee, each bitter sip unable to ease the numbness in his soul. The view outside remained still, like a faded painting with yellow leaves falling slowly, spinning in the breeze. The treetops whispered softly in the cool wind, but to Fred, every sound seemed like part of the endless silence within him. Since his wife had passed, this house, once filled with laughter and happiness, had become a place where only the distant echoes of the past lingered. Fred's eyes followed the surface of the lake in front of the house, where small ripples formed, creating thin streaks of light on the water. The scenery remained unchanged, but in his eyes, everything seemed blurry, dull, devoid of any life. He had lived here for so many years, waking up with his wife, sharing coffee and talking about the little things in life. Those days had been peaceful, full of love. But now, when he looked at this lake, all he saw was emptiness, a vast space that couldn't be filled with memories. The coffee cup in his hand had cooled, but he didn't bother to put it down. His hands ached, as if they wanted to give up everything. Part of him wanted to stand up, walk into the house, and do something to fill this void, but another part lacked the strength to move. Everything seemed too heavy, like an invisible burden he had to carry every day. Suddenly, a soft breeze blew by, carrying the gentle sounds of nature, as if trying to wake him from his immersion in sorrow. Fred turned and looked at the house, the place where she had once stood, laughed, and been the only light in his life. Every item in the house, from the armchair he sat in each evening to the wall clock they had bought together, now felt alien. These objects weren't just things. They were witnesses to love, to memories, to a life he and his wife had shared. But now, these items only intensified his longing, his pain, making Fred feel out of place in his own home. The empty chairs, The worn rugs, the silent paintings hanging on the walls, everything was part of a story that had passed, a story he could no longer continue to write. The family photos, where he and his wife smiled brightly together, were now mere evidence of a time gone by. Those sweet moments now only remained in memory, like faint wisps of clouds drifting across the sky. He wondered if those memories could last forever in his heart, or if they too would eventually fade. Like the days gone by, Fred stood up and walked into the house but found nothing to do. The objects, the furnishings, only made him feel more distant. The living room was silent, with no sounds, no one to talk to, no one to share his thoughts and feelings with. He walked to the sofa, sat down and rubbed his face with his hand, but couldn't shake the sorrow welling up inside him. This house had once held everything, but now it had become a cold, empty space, with nothing to hold on to. The walls of this house had once held so many memories. Together, he and his wife had chosen each painting, each decoration, creating a cozy space where every day was a joy. But now, this house felt like an empty shell, with no sounds, no life. Fred remembered the mornings when his wife would prepare breakfast, when she smiled gently and told stories with no beginning or end, yet they brought peace to both of them. Now, every morning, he was left with an empty house, a shadow that was absent. Fred stood up and walked to the window, looking outside. The surface of the lake remained calm, small waves lapping the shore, but they couldn't ease the loneliness that enveloped him. He thought about his wife, the woman who had shared so many years with him, built a family together, and shared both joys and sorrows. The sense of loss in his heart was immense, impossible to put into words. Those years together now seemed like faded memories, like a passing breeze that couldn't be held onto. The sound of his wife's place. Laughter seemed to echo in the air. Fred couldn't remember the words or the stories she used to tell, but he always remembered the feeling of happiness when he heard her laugh. That laugh had been the light, the lifeblood of this house, like a warm wave that filled his heart. But now, silence had replaced that laughter, as though everything had ended long ago. The house still stood, but it no longer belonged to him. He felt like a stranger in his own home, as though he was no longer a part of this life. Fred turned back and sat down on the sofa, looking out the window. Small waves lapped the shore, but they couldn't chase away the emptiness in his heart. Each drop of water in the lake, each leaf falling in the garden, reminded him of what was lost. Memories of his wife, of the happy days that had passed, flashed in his mind like an unreachable dream. This house, once a place that held everything, now only held the marks of a time gone by. Fred sat there, silently, in quiet solitude, watching the yellow leaves fall slowly onto the surface of the lake, like memories he could not hold on to. The scene shifts to a different setting, no longer Fred's grand mansion but a small, simple apartment. The gentle afternoon light filtered through the window, but it wasn't enough to warm the space inside. Kelly sat on a brown fabric-covered sofa, her face not showing much emotion, but her eyes revealed clear tension. She was staring at a stack of papers on the table, the numbers and words seeming to drift by without truly reaching her mind. Kelly's husband, David, sat across from her, gripping the contract tightly, his eyes focused and intense. They were discussing the family's financial situation, a topic that had become an unavoidable obsession over the past few months. The debt from consumer loans and poor financial decisions had pushed them into a deadlock, and they had few choices left. Kelly looked at her husband, her eyes betraying her worry. David placed the contract on the table and looked directly at his wife. "If we sell your dad's house, we can get out of this," he said, his voice deep and firm, but also carrying an urgency, as though he wanted to resolve this matter quickly. He didn't look at Kelly as he said it, as if he had grown so accustomed to the tension that he no longer wanted to confront the emotions tied to it. Kelly remained silent, her lips trembling as though she wanted to say something but held back. She stared at the numbers on the contract, her eyes becoming clouded with thought. In this apartment, there was no warmth like in Fred's house. Everything felt like it was on the edge, as if everything was slipping through their fingers. She felt the weight of this decision, but at the same time, a part of her felt powerless, unsure of what to do to change their current situation. Noticing Kelly's silence, David pressed on, his voice growing more urgent. "We don't have any other choice. If we sell that house, we can pay off the debts and maybe start fresh. You know your dad won't need the house anymore. He has too many problems to deal with. He can't take care of it." Kelly didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, her gaze fixed on the space in front of her, her thoughts seemingly tormenting her mind. Yes, Fred wouldn't need the house anymore. He was too old, too tired, and perhaps the house had become more of a burden than a place of joy for him. But Kelly couldn't shake the feeling of intrusion in this decision. It wasn't just Fred's house. It was the memories of a family that had once been an inseparable part of her life. How could she sell those memories? But then, as her gaze skimmed over the contract on the table, Kelly was reminded of the financial difficulties weighing heavily on her and David's lives. A sense of guilt and helplessness welled up inside her. Day after day, the debts piled up. Calls from creditors and loan agencies became a never-ending nightmare. She couldn't live like this anymore, couldn't let these financial pressures ruin their lives. And if selling the house could free her from it all, would it be worth it? David looked at Kelly, seeing the hesitation in her eyes. He sighed, gently reaching for her hand. "I know you don't want to do this, but if we don't, we'll continue living in this tension, not knowing what tomorrow will bring. You've seen it yourself. The situation can't go on forever." His voice was filled with worry, not just about the money, but also about the growing strain between them. Kelly said nothing, only lowering her head, her gaze lost in uncertainty, as if she were drowning in her own indecision. Kelly looked at her hand, tightening her grip as though trying to push away the chaotic thoughts in her mind. Part of her wanted to refuse, to return to the peaceful days with Fred, when financial decisions were never on the table for consideration. But reality had changed, and she knew she couldn't live in the past forever. Yet, the betrayal she felt when thinking about selling Fred's house was a wound that wouldn't heal. That house wasn't just a material possession, it was memory, love, sweat, and tears from her grandparents. It was a part of the family, a part of the past she couldn't easily discard. In that long moment, Kelly felt as though everything was spinning around her, from her husband, the debts, to Fred. Her gaze shifted from the papers on the table to David, then turned away again, as if unwilling to face the truth. David looked at her, said nothing further, but his eyes held empathy, as if he understood that making this decision wasn't easy for her. They were both trapped in an unavoidable situation. Finally, Kelly took a deep breath, and a difficult decision began to take shape in her heart. She nodded, a small gesture, but one heavy with significance. "All right," she said softly, yet firmly. "We'll sell the house." These words, though spoken softly, were a profound concession for Kelly. She knew that, once she made this decision, everything would change. She had sold a part of her memories, a part of her family, in exchange for an uncertain future, not knowing where it would lead. One autumn evening, as the golden leaves gently fell, Fred stood in the kitchen, holding a knife to slice through a piece of beef. Each thin slice of meat seemed like his thoughts, silent and full of worry. The scent of the cooking food gradually filled the air. The large house, once vibrant with the presence of the whole family, now felt empty and still, like a painting that had faded with time. Fred wondered if tonight, this dinner, would be the opportunity to reconnect with Kelly, to mend the broken ties between them. He still remembered clearly the days when the whole family gathered around the dinner table, laughter filling the air, intimate and warm conversations. Today, as he prepared the meal, Fred tried to hold on to those memories, thinking that perhaps a simple dinner could be the thread that drew Kelly closer to him, that maybe it could heal the growing distance between them. Even though he knew that their lives had changed too much over the years, Fred couldn't let go of hope. He dreamt of a reunion, a moment when they could sit together, share old stories, and perhaps, just perhaps, start over again. The outside scene seemed to mirror his mood. The soft golden light of the sunset streamed through the window, casting a weak reflection on the surface of the lake, creating a warm and peaceful atmosphere. Everything inside the house felt still, as if waiting for something, perhaps a miracle, or a chance to begin anew. Fred moved around the kitchen, slicing the meat, chopping onions, but his mind could not stop thinking about Kelly. The image of the girl he had cared for since she was little, now grown and distant, made his heart ache. When the doorbell rang, Fred jumped, but couldn't hide the joy that rose within him. He quickly walked to the door, the heavy wooden door seeming to carry the weight of the thoughts he'd been holding onto for so long. The door opened, and Kelly stood there, looking at him with a cold expression. She didn't smile, didn't make any affectionate gestures. She simply looked at him and then stepped inside. Fred stood frozen, unsure of what to say. Just a smile, just a warm glance, but there was nothing. Kelly nodded slightly, then sat down on the chair Fred had prepared earlier. Everything was the same, but between them, there was an invisible gap that Fred couldn't cross. Kelly looked at the plate of food he had carefully prepared, but didn't say a word. She just sat there, mechanically, her eyes fixed on the plate, not looking at him, not looking at the food. She was just there. Fred felt uneasy, but didn't want the atmosphere to become heavy. He smiled and tried to speak gently. "For this dinner, I've made the dishes you like. Do you remember when you were little, you loved this braised pork dish? I still remember you always finishing all the potatoes. We used to sit here together, talking about everything. Those days were wonderful." Kelly didn't immediately respond. Her gaze remained blank, not reflecting Fred's emotions. A few seconds passed, and then she gently replied, "Yes, I remember." Her voice was flat, lacking any particular emotion, just a dull acknowledgement. Fred didn't know how to continue the conversation. He wanted to say more, to share the memories of the past, but it felt as though every word was swept away by the wind. He truly didn't know what Kelly still remembered about those old days, about the warm dinners, the small joys within the family. Those memories, to her, perhaps were just the past, no longer holding any meaning. Every word he spoke only seemed to highlight the coldness between them. Seeing Kelly still staring at her bowl of rice, Fred tried again, hoping to find some connection. "I remember the days when we'd sit around the table, talking non-stop. Mom would always be laughing, and you'd tell funny stories. Those were the best days of my life. Do you remember?" Kelly picked up her chopsticks, took the bite of food, but still didn't look at Fred. "I remember," she replied, her voice colder, as if she were answering a question that no longer mattered. A slight smile flickered on her lips, but it quickly faded, replaced by the stifling silence. Fred felt like an invisible wall was rising between them. The more he tried to break it down, the further he seemed to be pushed away. He forced a smile, his heart heavy. "Do you remember the times when you and Mom would sit by the window, looking out into the yard, and we'd laugh when the breeze blew through? A scene like this, if you were here, it would be so much more joyful." Kelly put her chopsticks down, her gaze shifting to something intense, but not the concern Fred had hoped for. "Dad, that doesn't matter anymore. I need the house papers," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Her words were like a cold splash of water in Fred's face. Everything he had done, everything he had hoped for this dinner, instantly evaporated. The warm atmosphere he had tried to create was replaced by coldness, an enormous void between them. There was no laughter, no stories about the past. All that was left was a heavy silence. Fred stood up, unsure of what to do next. He took the papers from the drawer and handed them to Kelly, his mind tangled with thoughts. Kelly took the paper without saying anything, her eyes indifferent. He stood there, wanting to say something, but unable to speak. Every word now seemed unnecessary. He had hoped too much, and now, all that remained was silence. This dinner, instead of being an opportunity to reconnect, to heal, became a reminder of the distance, of the illusions he had nurtured. In that moment, Fred felt like he was standing alone in the large house, where everything had changed, where he no longer had a place in his daughter's life. Kelly's visits to Fred's house had become fewer and fewer, but each time she came, it stirred up emotions of deep sorrow within him. At first, whenever she came over, Fred still held a sense of anticipation, hoping for a moment when they could reconnect, like in the old days, when their family was whole. But over time, Kelly's visits became shorter and more distant. She came for simple, brief reasons and almost never showed any concern for Fred or his feelings. One winter afternoon, when the cold winds began to blow and the dim light of the afternoon filtered through the window, Kelly arrived at Fred's house once again. This time, she didn't call ahead, as she had before. Fred only knew when he saw her standing outside the door, her face devoid of any expression, as though she were a stranger entering his home. Fred stood still for a moment, a wave of emptiness rising within him, but he still couldn't help but open the door for his daughter. "You're here, Kelly?" Fred asked, his voice gentle, yet his eyes couldn't hide the concern. Every time he saw Kelly, he hoped for a change, for some closeness, even if just a little. Kelly didn't answer immediately. She just nodded and walked inside without saying anything else. Fred felt she was colder than usual, like a guest entering his home rather than his daughter. The paintings on the walls, the old armchairs that Fred and his wife had picked out together, seemed to lose all meaning. Everything in the house remained the same, but in Fred's heart, all that he once considered family was gradually fading. Fred stood by the door, watching Kelly sit down on the chair he had prepared. Not a word of greeting exchanged. At that moment, he felt lost, left alone in his own home, the place he had built with all his love and hope. It wasn't until a long while later that Kelly spoke, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Dad, the kitchen faucet is leaking. Can you fix it for me?" Her request came as a gentle plea, but it felt like an imposition. Hearing that, Fred felt a mix of emotions rise up inside him. He had always been ready to do anything for his daughter, but this made him feel like a servant in his own home. Kelly should have dealt with it herself, yet she came to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Fred couldn't refuse, couldn't say no, even though his heart was full of pain. Each time he did this, he felt more invisible in his own house, more like a tool than a father. "All right, I'll fix it," Fred said, his voice still gentle, though deep inside he couldn't hide his exhaustion. He walked to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and watched the water leak out. His hands trembled as he tightened each screw, but the shaking wasn't just from the task at hand, it was the sense of helplessness rising in his chest. He didn't know what to do to change the situation, didn't know how to make Kelly feel his presence in her life. While Fred struggled to fix the faucet, Kelly didn't look at him once. Her eyes were completely absorbed by her phone screen. Her fingers swiftly moved across the messages, typing, occasionally pressing a key with unconscious force. All she seemed to care about was the text on her screen, completely unaware of the man standing beside her. Fred watched her from a distance, and a heavy feeling welled up inside him. He thought back to when Kelly was a child, when she relied on him for everything. But now, she was grown, living her own life, and it seemed like she had forgotten the people who had loved and cared for her. Fred couldn't help but feel like a stranger in his own home. That feeling hurt more than any rejection. The faucet was finally fixed. Fred wiped his hands on an old cloth, stood up, and took a seat at the chair near the dining table. The fatigue was more evident on his face, but he still tried to keep a calm demeanor, as if everything were fine. However, deep down, he felt the vast difference between them. The invisible distance between them was growing, one that couldn't be bridged with old stories or the meals he tried to prepare. Kelly stood up, giving a quick nod as Fred finished the task. She didn't say thank you, only put her phone in her bag and turned to walk toward the door. She barely muttered a short, cold sentence. "I'm leaving." Not once did she look at Fred, not a single word that showed any concern. Kelly walked out, leaving Fred sitting in the empty space. Fred stood up, walked to the window, and looked at her retreating figure, feeling like a part of him was being left behind. With each step, Kelly grew further away, never once looking back. She had distanced herself from him for so long, not just physically, but emotionally. Fred didn't know where he had gone wrong, but he knew that no matter how hard he tried, the distance between them could no longer be bridged. In the silence, Fred turned back to the dining table, the place where he had prepared dinner, where he had hoped it would be an opportunity to get closer. But now, everything was different. He was no longer the father Kelly needed, no longer the person she turned to for comfort. Everything had changed, and Fred realized that no matter what he did, Kelly was no longer the little girl who needed him to protect her. She was a stranger, someone he could no longer reach. On a cold autumn evening, Fred returned to the mansion after a long day. The sky had turned dark, with gray clouds covering everything, as though reflecting his own mood. There were no stars, no warmth from any light other than the faint glow of the lamp at the entrance. The mansion's door, which he had passed through countless times over the years, was now shut tight, cold and unyielding, just like his heart in that moment. Fred stared at the door, and a strange feeling overwhelmed him. Despite having lived here for so many years, for the first time, he felt like a stranger standing outside his own home. Each step he took down the path leading to the house felt heavy, like the slow steps of someone heading toward an inevitable end. The path before the house was covered in dry leaves, the yellow leaves rustling beneath his feet, reminding him of the autumn that had arrived, and also symbolizing the irreversible changes in his life. Each falling leaf seemed to whisper a reminder of time passing, of memories slipping away that he couldn't hold on to. With every step he took on this path, it felt like a journey with no destination, no completeness, only a sense of loneliness surrounding him. Standing before the heavy wooden door of the mansion, Fred raised his hand and knocked gently. The sound echoed in the still night, but there was no reply. The silence that followed felt like something had died within him. He knew that the knock on the door wasn't meant for a welcoming, but rather an excuse to hope, though he knew that hope was nothing but an illusion. The door creaked open slowly, but instead of a familiar face, a warm smile. It was Kelly, his daughter, standing there with a cold expression, showing no signs of affection. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, not inviting him inside, not asking how he was, just looking at him with an expression of indifference, filled with emotional distance. Fred immediately sensed the change. The distance between him and Kelly, step by step, was growing wider, like a crack that was slowly widening. He looked at his daughter, wanting to ask her something, to seek some warmth, some trace of the old days, but every word got stuck in his throat. She didn't invite him in, didn't say a word of greeting. The entire house, every wall, every room, was silent. Everything had become a mute witness to a lost past. "I didn't think you'd come here," Kelly said, her voice soft but devoid of any emotion. Her words felt like a confirmation that their relationship had ended, that there was nothing left to salvage. Fred stood frozen, his heart feeling like it was struck with force, a sharp pain rising in his chest. He had hoped to see some trace of his daughter, some softness, a glance of sympathy, but there was nothing. Kelly just stared at him indifferently, as if he was no longer her father, but a stranger standing outside her life. "I wanted to talk to you," Fred said, his voice trembling from the lump rising in his throat. "I've tried, Kelly. I want us to sit down together, like before, and share everything." Kelly didn't answer immediately. She stood there, her eyes still fixed on him. Then, as if making a final decision, Kelly spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Don't come here anymore. This isn't your home." Her words hit Fred like a knife, deep in his heart. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Everything he had tried, all the hopes he had placed in Kelly, were torn apart by a single cold sentence. The feeling of being rejected, cast aside, not just materially, but emotionally, felt like something had run dry in their relationship. Fred stood motionless, unable to respond right away. He looked at Kelly in disbelief, as though the words that had come from her mouth couldn't be real. He had nurtured hope that his daughter would understand, that she would return to the love between father and daughter. But now, all he got in return was a definite rejection. Kelly was no longer his daughter. She had become a stranger, someone who had closed the door to the past and moved forward in her own life, leaving him behind. Not knowing what to do, Fred turned, walked out the door, his steps heavy as if an invisible force was pulling him back. The feeling of being abandoned, not just by his daughter but by life itself, overwhelmed him. Each step on the path covered in dry leaves felt like a step away from himself, away from family, away from the home he had once loved so much. The dry leaves under his feet seemed to remind him of the passage of time, of things that couldn't be held on to. Each falling leaf felt like another part of his memory left behind, something irretrievable. The nights spent sitting with his wife in this house, the times he and Kelly had shared conversations, those were all now memories, lost to the past. Fred walked in the silence of the night, each step echoing, but inside him, there was no sound left. It felt as though he was walking alone on a long road, with no one beside him, no one to see the pain he carried in his heart. The cold of autumn made his loneliness even more oppressive. The whole path, the whole surrounding space, seemed to want to swallow him whole, and Fred, in that moment, felt like there was no place for him to return to. On a cold, rainy autumn evening, Fred returned to his old apartment after a long day. The cold air from outside seeped into every corner of the cramped room. The apartment, though aged and marked by the passage of time, had always been a place where he found peace whenever he needed to escape the noise and conflicts of life. However, tonight, as he entered this room, he felt a strange sense of alienation, as if he no longer belonged here. This small space no longer held warmth or love. It was now a cold, empty place, much like his own heart. The yellow light in the room cast a faint glow, barely enough to illuminate the space. The grayish walls, faded by time, looked pitiful, much like his soul in that moment. Every time he entered this room, Fred felt like he was walking backward into the past, facing the failures and losses he could never change. The small room, with its old armchair and worn wooden table, served as a reminder of the days when he had lived here with his wife, when the family had been whole, and when he could still feel the love and connection. Fred sighed, his weary feet dragging across the room, but he found nothing to do. All that remained in this room were the family photos he had left on the wooden table. These photos were not just images, but precious fragments of a time long gone. In these pictures, he saw his wife smiling brightly, her long hair flowing, her eyes full of love. And Kelly, the girl he had loved since she was in her mother's womb, now an adult but so distant. Those photos were now just fragments of the past, memories he could never reclaim. Fred stood still, his eyes fixed on the photos, his hands trembling as he held an old family picture. He remembered the moment when this photo was taken. It had been a hot summer day, when the family had gathered in the garden, standing together in a happy smile. They had created beautiful memories together, moments of warmth. His wife had always been the one who brought light to the family, with her gentle smile and boundless love. But now, all of that was in the past. His wife was gone, and now his daughter, too, was no longer the child he had nurtured all those years. Kelly had distanced herself, not just physically, but emotionally. Where did I go wrong? That question kept echoing in Fred's mind. He looked at the family picture, his hands shaking, as if he were searching for a reason, an answer to everything that had happened. He remembered all the efforts he had put in, all the sacrifices to keep the family happy. But in the end, all he had received was distance, coldness from his daughter. How could he explain this change? How could a father understand that his daughter could turn away from him after everything he had done for her? Fred sat down in the armchair, still holding the family picture tightly in his hand. The atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. He felt trapped in his own memories, unable to escape, unable to return to the past. The memories of his wife, of the times they had spent together, the evenings sitting together talking, now felt like haunting echoes he couldn't banish. He remembered the times his wife had embraced him, comforting him when he felt weary. She had always been the pillar of the family, the one who kept everything steady. But now he had lost her, and he had lost Kelly as well. He felt like a stranger in his own home, no longer having a place in the lives of his loved ones. The family picture in his hand now felt like a mirror reflecting all his mistakes. Every time he looked at it, he saw himself as a failure. Where did I go wrong? That question wasn't just self-blame, it was a soft cry into the darkness of his soul. Every decision he had made, every step he had taken, now brought only pain. He should have known that love couldn't be forced, that he couldn't hold on to things that had already changed. But all these years, he hadn't realized that. And now, he was paying the price for his shortcomings. Fred leaned back in the chair, his eyes closing, and he began to remember the words his wife had once said to him. "Fred, don't let anyone take advantage of your kindness." Those words echoed in his mind like a warning, but he hadn't understood, hadn't listened. Every time he tried to help, tried to create a happy family, he had ignored his own needs. He had spent his whole life trying to please others, meeting every demand without realizing that he too needed space for himself, a right to live for himself. In that moment, Fred realized that he had lost not only his wife, not only Kelly, but also himself. He had let his kindness become a burden for those around him, and now he stood amidst the ruins he had created. The self-reproach kept ringing in his head, but he couldn't go back, couldn't change the past. All he could do now was face himself in the darkness of the small room, in the silence of the late night, where only unanswered questions lingered. Fred looked at the photo one last time, then gently placed it on the table. The feeling of loss, the emptiness, filled him again. He sat there, in this old room, facing all of his mistakes. The loneliness slowly consumed him, like a darkness that couldn't be chased away, couldn't be escaped. Fred sat there, in the dense darkness of the old room, the pale yellow light, casting a faint glow from the ceiling, creating a silent, still atmosphere. This small room had once been the place where he felt safe and warm, where he and his wife had spent their happy days building a home together. But now, this room was no longer a refuge. It no longer held warmth or love. Instead, it was a space of emptiness, loneliness permeating every corner. Fred felt trapped in the past, each step he took in the room like walking over fragments of memories he could no longer piece together. It was late, but he couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about what had been. The days with his wife, the days when the family was still whole, now only existed as faded patches of memory. The times he and his wife had walked hand in hand, the gentle conversations about the future, were now just shattered images in Fred's mind. None of it could be returned. His hands trembled as he gently stroked an old family photo, a picture of him, his wife, and Kelly, when she was a young girl, her eyes shining brightly, and her smile carefree. Fred stared at the photo, then placed his hand over his eyes, feeling a tightness rise in his chest. Back then, everything seemed perfect. They had been a complete family, a family he had spent his life building, protecting. But now, that photo only brought pain, an emptiness that couldn't be erased. Where did I go wrong? The question echoed in Fred's mind. A question without an answer, no explanation that could make him feel any lighter. The mistakes, the wrong decisions, the things he did without thinking, now all felt like scars in his mind. Every time he looked at that photo, Fred felt he had missed opportunities to change, to do something differently, to keep his family close. In that moment, a voice suddenly rang out in Fred's mind, like a spark in the darkness, a familiar sound, comforting yet painfully suffocating. "Fred, don't let anyone take advantage of your kindness. I want you to be strong." It was his wife's voice, the voice she had spoken to him with when they had shared everything in life. Her words, though few, were always reminders. Advice she knew he needed to hear, though he hadn't understood at the time. Fred gently closed his eyes, and it felt as though she were sitting beside him, the light from her words soaking into his soul. She didn't want him to continue living in blind sacrifice, didn't want him to become a weak person, unable to protect himself. She wanted him to be stronger, not for anyone else, but for himself. She knew that Fred's kindness sometimes became a burden, that he had sacrificed so much for others without noticing his own needs and feelings. Those words echoed in Fred's mind, like a warning he now truly understood. Back then, when his wife was still alive, he couldn't fully grasp everything she had tried to say. He always thought that sacrifice, helping others, was the right thing to do, the only way to keep the family happy. But now, after she was gone, and the mistakes were clearer than ever, Fred realized that that sacrifice hadn't brought anything good. In reality, it had only worn him down, and gradually, it had caused him to lose the most important things in his life. Fred raised his head, his eyes slowly searching for a piece of his wife's memory. Every time she spoke about strength, he had felt like he couldn't live up to that expectation. But now, he understood that strength didn't mean enduring everything alone. It didn't mean unconditional sacrifice. Strength meant rising when everything falls apart. It meant loving oneself, setting boundaries, and knowing when to say no to protect oneself. The things his wife had wanted him to understand, he only truly realized in this moment, in this room, facing himself alone. Looking at the family photo, Fred felt a deep sadness, but at the same time, he felt an unnamed sense of relief. Even though he couldn't change the past, even though he couldn't go back and fix everything, he still had time to start over. He had lost his wife, lost his daughter, lost his home, but he still had a chance to live again, to be stronger, to find himself. I want you to be strong. His wife's words now weren't just simple advice. They were a promise, a reminder that he was never a failure, as long as he still had the choice to change. Fred knew that, even if he had to lose everything, he could still stand up. He could rebuild his life. He could start again with himself. And, more than ever, he understood that strength wasn't about silent endurance, but about daring to face oneself, accepting mistakes, and moving forward. His wife's words still echoed in his mind, like a light piercing through the thick darkness, illuminating the path ahead. Fred stood up, placing his hands on the table, feeling the warmth from his own resolve. He was no longer weak, no longer someone who lived only to please others. He would find his strength within himself, so that he would no longer be bound by the wrong decisions of the past. The light in his wife's memory was not just a reminder, but a source of strength that helped Fred stand firm, guiding him to find a new direction in life. And in that moment, he knew that, even though he might no longer have everything he once had, he could still live a meaningful life, a life of freedom, no longer shackled by the past, and stronger than ever before. Fred walked into the lawyer's office, the atmosphere inside slightly cold but quiet and solemn. The white-painted walls, the gray fabric-covered chairs, everything created an environment that made it clear he was stepping into a place of significance. Within that space, everything seemed still, as if waiting for a decision that would change everything. Fred stood at the door, looking into the room, a sense of emptiness rising within him. He didn't want to be here, but he knew he had to. It had been too long, and he couldn't continue living in the past. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman, not tall but with sharp and calm eyes, sat at the desk. She looked up when she heard Fred's footsteps, her gaze not unfamiliar but filled with quiet understanding. She smiled gently, but in that smile was deep empathy and professionalism. Fred couldn't remember how many times he had faced people like her, people who stood outside his life, yet were the ones helping him navigate through the crucial decisions. Fred walked in and sat down across from the desk. He felt as though he was preparing for a battle, one he knew he had to face long ago, but the tension still gripped his heart. The papers on the desk, the unsigned contracts, the events yet to unfold, all of it made the air heavier. In this room, time seemed to stop, and Fred felt each second pass as a challenge, a test of endurance to complete what he had to do. "You can rest assured," the lawyer began, her voice soft but confident. "This is the final step in the asset transfer process. We just need to confirm everything once more, then sign, and it will be complete." Fred looked at the pristine white papers in front of him. The words, the clauses, all clear, but painfully dry, cold. Each word on that paper felt like an end to a part of his life. The house he had spent his life building, a house he had hoped would hold the family memories, was now being sold, transferred to a charity. The pain of letting go of that house was indescribable. But he knew this was something he had to do to free himself, to reclaim a part of himself. Fred looked at the lawyer again and nodded slightly. "I understand," he said, his voice low, but with a strong sense of determination, no longer hesitant or uncertain. In his eyes was a resolve, even though his heart still carried the memories, the pain he couldn't forget. But he was tired of dragging things out. It was time to sever ties with the past and move forward. The lawyer began pointing to the points on the paper, each clause regarding the transfer of ownership, the requirements and commitments from both parties. Fred only needed to sign where indicated, and the document would officially become a part of history. A part of history he couldn't change, but one he could choose to end. The sense of exhaustion rose within Fred, but it wasn't weakness. It was acceptance. He accepted that the time had come to let go. As Fred picked up the pen, his hand shook slightly. It wasn't from fear, but from the feeling that a part of his life was about to slip away. He wasn't just signing a document. He was signing the end of a past, the hopes and dreams he had nurtured for so long. The feeling was heavy, like an unavoidable acceptance. Each time the pen touched the paper, Fred heard the faint click in the stillness of the room. The sound of the pen seemed to remind him of change, of a decision that couldn't be undone. The click of the pen felt like a reminder of the permanence of time, of decisions that, once made, couldn't be altered. He signed each line, each word, and with every signature it felt like a part of him was being torn away. But he didn't stop. He knew this was the path he had to take, no matter how difficult it was. When he finished signing the final document, Fred placed the pen down on the table and looked at everything he had just done. It was all done now, and he felt like he had just completed an important ritual, one that would change his entire life. The determination in his eyes wasn't just about the papers, but about the liberation he had achieved. No longer bound by the past, no longer restricted by the life he couldn't change, he had done something he never thought he could. "Thank you, Fred," the lawyer said, her voice soft and full of sympathy. "Now, the house will be used to help those in need. You've done something very meaningful." Fred nodded slightly. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Her words couldn't make him feel any lighter, but he knew he had done the right thing. He was no longer held back by painful memories, no longer bound by things he couldn't change. He had truly taken control of his life. Fred stood up, walked out of the office, and in that moment, a sense of relief spread through him. It wasn't satisfaction, but release. Each step he took on the long road outside the lawyer's office felt strong, a step toward a future he had chosen. The determination, the resilience he felt with every step wasn't the strength others expected, but the strength to face himself, to rise from the losses and the pain. Fred stepped outside, facing the fresh, hopeful sky. Although he couldn't change the past, he now felt that he could start again. Fred stood alone in the old apartment, the faint light of the afternoon gradually fading, leaving only darkness enveloping the small room. The feeling of exhaustion and tension seemed to have never left him. But today, something within him was changing. In recent days, he had started to realize the necessity of rebuilding his self-respect, facing himself, and reflecting on what he had lost. He had lived for others for so long, living to meet every demand and need without ever thinking about himself. But now, he had decided that he could no longer live in that unconditional sacrifice. A part of Fred felt uneasy, but another part felt stronger than ever. It was the feeling of a man slowly coming to understand that loving himself was necessary, even if it meant making difficult sacrifices. Self-respect wasn't something easy to rebuild, especially when he had been so used to living just to please others. But he knew that if he didn't change, he would remain trapped in a cycle of hurt and insecurity. And today, when Kelly came with a small request, Fred knew this was the moment to begin. The door suddenly opened, and Kelly walked in, just like every time before, without notice, without waiting for Fred to prepare. She entered the room with a hurried expression, her eyes weary, as if carrying a burden Fred couldn't fully comprehend. He looked at her, and in that moment, a strange feeling rose within him. She was no longer the child he had loved so deeply. She was a grown woman, with her own worries and demands he could no longer blindly meet. "Dad, the kitchen faucet is leaking again. Can you fix it for me?" Kelly asked, her voice soft, but devoid of warmth, without any affection. The request seemed insignificant, but to Fred, each word of hers felt like a monumental challenge. He had grown so accustomed to these small requests, the tasks Kelly could do herself, but always asked him to do instead. Every time, he willingly helped, but inside, he often wondered, why do I always accept everything without a word of refusal? Fred stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on Kelly, a feeling of exhaustion rising within him. This time, he knew he couldn't continue living in this resigned way. He couldn't keep doing things for her, couldn't keep helping without ever being appreciated. This was the moment he needed to change. And if he didn't, he would forever be the father who always accepted sacrifice without receiving anything in return. Kelly looked at Fred, her eyes showing no concern or sense of needing help. She stood there, waiting for his approval, just like every other time. But this time, Fred couldn't continue like this. He took a deep breath, clenched his hands into fists, and slowly walked towards her. "Kelly," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I can't do this for you anymore." Kelly stopped, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she didn't understand why he was refusing such a small request. She furrowed her brows, and a hint of frustration appeared on her face. "Dad, I just need a little help. Why are you refusing me?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Fred looked into her eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt he had to be firm. "You can do it yourself, Kelly. I've done everything for you, but now it's time for you to learn how to handle things on your own. I can't keep doing this for you." His voice wasn't loud, but within it was a determination he didn't expect. It was a firmness he had never had with his daughter, but he knew that if he didn't say no now, there would never be another chance. The feeling of rejecting his daughter's request, even something as small as this, made Fred feel like he had just overcome a great challenge. It wasn't coldness, it wasn't distance, it was a form of self-protection. He had loved his daughter for so long, so blindly, without realizing that he too had the right to love himself, to demand respect from others, even from his own children. Kelly stood still, her eyes locked on Fred, not saying anything immediately. A brief moment of confusion passed through her gaze, but then she said nothing more. She turned and walked slowly toward the door. Not in a hurry, but slowly, as if not used to him rejecting her. Fred stood there, feeling a part of his heart being torn apart, but another part felt lighter. He knew this would upset her, but it was something she needed to learn, and he also needed to learn to love himself. After Kelly left, Fred turned back to the table and sat down in the old armchair. The feeling of exhaustion was still there, but this time, it wasn't the exhaustion of endless sacrifice. It was the exhaustion of someone who had just crossed an important threshold in life. It was the first time he had truly said no to his daughter, and for the first time in many years, he felt like he had done something right. Fred looked around at the old things in the room, the belongings he had been attached to for so many years. The feeling of the past, The sacrifices made for too long gradually receded, making room for a sense of peace in his soul. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could change the way he lived, how he faced his children, and how he loved himself. For the first time in many years, Fred felt stronger. Not because he had done something grand, but because he had learned to protect himself. The no he said today, though a short word, carried the self-respect he had lost for so long. And this time, he had found it again, even if it was just the first step. That day, Fred's mansion was no longer as silent as it had always been. The atmosphere in the large, empty house was now filled with anticipation. The sun had risen high, and its light shone through the large windows, reflecting off the wooden floor, but the space didn't seem to brighten as it would with the presence of light. On the contrary, it felt heavier than ever, as if the house was holding onto everything Fred had tried to protect. But now, everything was beginning to fall apart. Fred stood silently before the front door, his hand gripping the doorknob without opening it immediately. In his mind, there was a raging storm, but outwardly, he maintained his calm. He was no longer the man who easily succumbed to requests and pleas, and he was no longer the person who lost himself so easily. Today, Fred knew this wasn't just an ordinary meeting. It was a confrontation that he couldn't avoid. Kelly and her husband's family would arrive, and this was the moment he had to face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Fred had prepared for this moment, though he didn't know how the confrontation would unfold. He felt a strong sense of resolve, as if everything ahead had been carefully planned. But that determination wasn't as easy as he thought. Even though his heart was full of resolve, the silence in the house made everything seem uncertain. Behind his calm exterior, Fred couldn't hide the confusion and anxiety about what was about to happen. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence in the house. Fred heard footsteps on the stone floor as Kelly and her family entered. Without needing to look back, he knew they had arrived. Kelly hadn't given any prior notice, but Fred knew she would come. What had transpired between them, what had led them to this moment, couldn't be solved by a casual encounter. And this time, he would not back down. He could no longer live in endless sacrifice. He could no longer live, according to his daughter's demands, without recognition or respect from her. The front door slowly opened, and Kelly stepped in. She stood there, looking at Fred with a confident expression, as though she were in her own home. She didn't seem shy or worried. On the contrary, she smiled lightly, her eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. Behind Kelly, her husband, a tall, well-dressed man, and a few members of her husband's family walked in, laughing and chatting happily, as if everything had already been arranged. Everything felt as if they were visiting a friend or a relative, without any tension or worry in the air. Fred stood there, still silent, his eyes never leaving Kelly. He didn't speak, not even to greet them. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, not allowing any other emotion to overtake him. In his eyes, there was a silence full of power, a power he had regained after all these years. In the past, he had allowed himself to be taken advantage of, a man who easily accepted every request without resistance. But today, he would no longer be that person. He would stand firm against every condition, every demand Kelly and her family made. Kelly noticed Fred's silence, but she wasn't surprised. She was used to his silence. But today, there was a distinct difference. She could sense the resolve in his eyes, the change in his demeanor, and it caught her off guard. She didn't know what to do with this change, but Kelly always had confidence in her ability to control the situation. "Dad, we need to talk," Kelly spoke up, her voice soft but with a hint of determination. Fred looked at her, his gaze unchanged, unyielding. "We can talk, but not the way you want," he responded, his voice low but clear, without the slightest wavering. Kelly paused, but quickly regained her confident demeanor. "Dad, we're just talking about the house. If you don't want to sell, we'll have to find another way. We need to act fast, or it'll be too late." Kelly's words felt like an assertion that she only wanted to resolve everything quickly, her way. But Fred was no longer easily drawn into that. He had signed the papers to transfer the house to charity, but that didn't mean he would continue being manipulated by her unreasonable demands. "The house is no longer mine, Kelly," Fred said, his voice calm but sharp, like a reminder. "I've made my decision. I did what was right, and I don't want to hear any more about this." The space grew quiet for a moment, with only the sound of steady breathing from the people around. Kelly remained silent, as if unsure what to say next. She hadn't expected Fred to be so resolute. She hadn't expected him to refuse her demands. The sense of self-satisfaction she had suddenly shifted to confusion, but she still tried to maintain her composure. A heavy silence passed, and finally, Kelly quietly turned, leading her husband and his family out, without saying another word. As they left, Fred stood there, his eyes following them, until their figures were completely out of sight. In that moment, Fred didn't feel pain or regret. He only felt an unusual sense of relief, as though he had done something he hadn't dared to do for many years. Everything around him remained quiet, but Fred knew that deep within himself, he had found peace. A peace that didn't come from winning this confrontation, but from standing firm with himself. This confrontation wasn't just with Kelly, it was with himself, with everything he had accepted in the past. And today, he had decided that he would never accept weakness again. The atmosphere in the mansion became still, as though it had just been tidied up but lacked any vitality. Fred stood there, in front of the large door of the house he had once poured his heart into building. This house, now, no longer felt like a place he belonged. Everything in this home seemed like a burden, not just in material terms but emotionally as well. The feeling he had now was not one of disappointment, but a sense of determination, a release that he had fought hard to achieve. But now, once again, he had to face the past. And this time, he wasn't afraid. Fred stood still as he heard the sound of a car stopping in the driveway, the car door opening, and footsteps approaching the house. Kelly and her husband's family had arrived, and Fred no longer felt any surprise. He knew today would be a confrontation he could not avoid. Not because he didn't love Kelly, but because he loved himself more. He had made his decision, and now was the time for everything to be said, even if it might cause pain. The door opened, and Kelly stepped in first. She was still the Kelly he had known, but there was something different about her, in the way she entered the house, in the way she looked at him. She walked in with a confident expression, without hesitation, and behind her, her husband and some members of his family followed. They all smiled, looking happy and comfortable, as if they were visiting a close friend, not a father. The self-satisfaction was evident on Kelly's face, but Fred no longer allowed himself to be influenced by that gaze. Without a greeting, Fred stood still, staring at her. The entire space seemed to pause, no longer filled with the chatter or laughter of guests. Fred stood there, silently, his gaze unwavering, not letting any other emotion take over. It wasn't because he lacked feelings, but because he knew that silence was what was needed right now. What he was about to do wasn't a confrontation filled with anger, nor was it a hurried response. It was a statement. Kelly stopped in front of him, her gaze briefly scanning him, then shifting to look at the house around them, as if seeking approval. "Dad, we need to talk," Kelly spoke, her voice calm but with a sense of urgency. She brushed her hair back, looking up at him with a look of certainty, as if everything had already been arranged and she only needed his agreement. Fred didn't respond immediately, standing there, his gaze following every movement of Kelly. In that moment, he didn't see her as the daughter he had once loved, but as a grown woman with her own goals and determination. That feeling, though painful, made Fred realize he was no longer bound by her. He was no longer the man who would always comply with her requests, nor the one who was easily taken advantage of. He was the man who had regained his self-respect. Finally, after a long moment of silence, Fred stepped out from where he stood, not hurriedly, but decisively. He walked to the desk, where an envelope had already been prepared. A simple envelope. But inside, it lay a truth Kelly couldn't have expected. Fred turned back, slowly handing the envelope to Kelly. She took it but didn't open it right away. Her eyes looked at Fred, a silent question but full of doubt. What he was about to reveal wasn't what she had expected. Fred didn't speak, just stood there, still maintaining his silent but firm demeanor. Kelly, though a brief flash of confusion passed through her eyes, didn't stop looking at him, trying to find some sign, some change in his attitude. She slowly opened the envelope, a strange feeling rising in her chest as her hand touched the paper. When she pulled out the deed, her eyes stopped, and in that moment, everything she saw seemed to spiral into her mind, making everything around her blur. The paper in her hand was the deed to transfer the house to a charity, an organization Fred had chosen to inherit his property. The document was properly signed, with all the legal terms and conditions. No mistakes, no possibility of turning back. Kelly stood frozen, the paper in her hand feeling heavier, as if its weight wasn't just material but a powerful mental shock. She read the paper, then read it again, but the truth couldn't be changed. Her face paled, and her hands trembled as she held the paper. It felt as though the entire world had collapsed beneath her. The plans, the illusions she had built were suddenly shattered. The house she thought would be her salvation, the key to her family's future, was no longer hers. The overwhelming sense of loss rose within her. But what hurt the most wasn't the loss of the property, but the fact that Fred had done this without consulting her, without asking for her opinion. He had done this quietly, decisively, as a declaration that she was no longer the only one with the power to make decisions in this family. Fred said nothing, just stood there, silent. Each moment of his silence, each unspoken word, felt like the exact answer Kelly needed to hear. There were no justifications, no explanations, only the truth laid bare, undeniable. Every word became unnecessary, as Fred's silence was the clearest response. Kelly still said nothing, her eyes glazed over, a mixture of anger and disappointment blending together. She couldn't speak, couldn't react immediately. She was too shocked, too surprised, to fully understand what Fred had done. But it seemed that deep inside, Kelly understood that Fred's decision wasn't an act of revenge or confrontation. It was a liberation for himself. And despite her desire to change everything, she couldn't do anything. The truth had been spoken, and Fred no longer had to bear manipulation or demands from anyone. Finally, Kelly took the paper, said nothing, turned, and left, with her husband and his family following. Fred stood there, still silent. His feeling now wasn't satisfaction or triumph, but peace. Everything had been resolved, not through argument, but through the resolve within himself. And as Kelly left, Fred felt a relief he could not express in words. Fred stepped out of the mansion, walking with light steps, not because he lacked weight, but because he felt a sense of relief. A feeling he had not been able to find for so long, one he hadn't even imagined would come. The large house, once filled with memories, no longer felt like a place he belonged. Everything inside seemed to carry too much pain, too many things from the past, things that could not be changed. And now, as he stepped outside, his steps no longer felt heavy. He was not in a hurry, nor was he anxious. Everything had been decided, and there was nothing more to worry about or fear. The path along the lake stretched ahead of him, vast and quiet. Yellow leaves gently fell from the trees, forming a thin carpet on the path. Each step Fred took seemed to merge with the vast space around him, a space no longer controlled by the past, no longer confined by what had happened. Every light breeze that passed made his hair rise, making him feel that freedom was not just something he had sought, but something he truly deserved. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze from the lake, carrying the scent of earth, wet leaves, and the gentle mist. Everything felt like a cleansing of his soul. The worries, the tension, and the burdens of the past slowly faded away. Fred felt everything settling within his heart. Before, he always felt trapped, as if every day that passed was just another day without escape. But now, with each step on this path, he wasn't just walking away from the past. He was walking toward rediscovering himself. Fred looked down at the surface of the lake. The shimmering water reflected the clear blue sky and the soft clouds drifting by. The lake was calm, with no ripples, no disturbance, like a mirror reflecting the thoughts in his heart. He no longer felt the inner turmoil he once did, no longer felt the sensation of living only for others, striving to meet expectations without ever having the right to love himself. Today, he had found serenity, a peace in his heart he had never experienced, not once in all these years. The distant sound of birds singing, a soft melody echoing in the quiet space, made Fred pause, closing his eyes to listen. That sound was not just birdsong. It was part of the freedom he was now feeling. The birdsong seemed like a greeting to the change in his life, to the awakening he had gone through. Fred knew that life wouldn't always be easy, but today, he felt he had found a part of happiness, a part of peace he had long missed. He continued walking, his steps light on the trail by the lake. This feeling of freedom didn't come from having defeated someone or doing something grand. It came from daring to say no when necessary, from choosing the harder path, but one that brought respect for himself. He was no longer the man others could take advantage of, but a man who knew how to love himself, set boundaries, and protect what he truly deserved. Every step Fred took was a step into his own world. The path along the lake was not long, but with each step, he felt as though he was leaving behind the shackles of the past. The burdens had been laid down, and he no longer had to live for others. He was no longer a man who loved blindly, nor a man who only sought to please those around him at the cost of his own well-being. The days gone by, the mistakes, the suffering, all of it had become part of the past, and now, Fred was ready to begin again. That feeling of freedom was like a fresh breeze, bringing renewal to his soul. Fred no longer felt trapped in painful memories. Instead, he felt liberated, not because he had given up part of his past, but because he had accepted change and understood that he could start anew. He no longer needed to carry the burdens, no longer needed to live in the shadow of his mistakes. He had learned how to live for himself, and that was the freedom he had been seeking all these years. Fred continued walking, his steps becoming steadier. Each step was firmer, each breath deeper. He no longer needed to race against time, no longer needed to seek approval from anyone else. He only needed to walk and experience what was around him, to feel each moment of life, each beat of his heart. Each step now was a statement to himself, to everything he had overcome, and everything he was moving toward. He no longer felt tired, no longer felt the loss. And as the light of the sun began to fade, as the sky turned soft orange, Fred paused for a moment, looking at the vast sky. The feeling of freedom spread through him, not just as a physical liberation, but as a spiritual rebirth. Fred understood that he didn't need to search for happiness elsewhere. It had always been present in simple moments like this. It was found in walking with self-respect, in taking control of his own life, and in being true to himself. The feeling of freedom wasn't one of triumph or victory. It didn't come from what he had done or achieved. It came from the decision to change, the decision to walk his own path, unbound by the past and unafraid of the future. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would continue walking, because he had rediscovered himself, and that was the most important thing. The final scene of the story feels like an eternal moment, a peaceful space that Fred never thought he would find. The small apartment he had chosen as his refuge after so many years of struggles had now become a significant part of his life, a place where every morning he could feel the gentle passage of time, free from burdens and external demands. Fred sat on the porch of the apartment, holding a warm cup of coffee, his eyes gazing out at the calm lake in the distance. In the light of the setting sun, the space seemed to be bathed in a gentle golden hue, neither blinding nor harsh, but full of life. The last rays of the day cast streaks of light on the water's surface, reflecting the sky and the trees along the lake, making the scenery appear hazy, as if floating between reality and memory. Fred didn't rush, didn't hurry, but simply sat there, lost in his own thoughts. The days that had passed, the long and challenging journey, now seemed to have come to an end, or at least transitioned into a new chapter. The memories of the house, of all he had lost, no longer caused him pain. Instead, he felt as if he had just weathered a storm, like a leaf drifting on the lake's surface, finally swept away from the tempests, leaving only the stillness and peace that he never imagined he would experience. That feeling was strange. It wasn't the feeling of victory, nor was it the joy of triumph after a battle, but rather a sensation steeped in tranquility. Fred was no longer the man in pain, no longer the father who had sacrificed everything for his family while forgetting about himself. He had found the most important thing in his life: self-respect. For years, he had lived like a ghost in his own home, always following the requests of others, always striving to meet expectations without receiving recognition or love. He had allowed himself to fall into a cycle of blind sacrifice and constant loss. But now, sitting there on the simple wooden chair, in front of the apartment porch, with his hand holding the warm coffee cup, he no longer felt regret about what had passed. Everything, though lost and difficult, had taught him a valuable lesson. To love others, you must first love yourself. And to live a fulfilled life, you must have self-respect, know when to refuse, and know how to say no when necessary. Fred looked at the surface of the lake, where the calm water reflected the sky, the drifting clouds, and the falling leaves. Each leaf seemed to symbolize a part of the past that had been left behind, a part of the burdens he had cast away. Every leaf that fell was a reminder that, though life may push us through many challenges, each of us will eventually find a stopping point, a moment of peace. The falling leaves weren't an end, but a transition, a part of the endless flow of life. At that moment, Fred no longer felt the loneliness he once did. Though the large house now stood empty, with only him in it, though Kelly no longer looked at him the way she once had, though much of the past seemed to have vanished, he knew that he had found liberation from his own inner self. He was no longer the man who lived only to please others, but a father, a man, who knew how to stand firm and protect his own dignity. He had learned that sometimes loving also means knowing when to let go, knowing when to say no, and that love doesn't always mean unconditional sacrifice. Fred brought the coffee cup to his lips, taking a small sip, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The gentle aroma of the coffee, combined with the fresh air from the lake, created a feeling that was both familiar and new. This was the first time he truly felt that he had the right to be happy, to live for himself. Every sip of coffee was a reminder of the relief he had found after years of living in exhaustion and pain. The last rays of the sun brushed the surface of the lake, making the scene come alive with a vibrant glow. The sound of the wind, rustling through the trees, the distant birdsong, all created a soundtrack for this moment of tranquility in Fred's heart. He didn't feel the need to say anything more, didn't need words of congratulations or encouragement. Everything had already been experienced and felt deeply in his heart. Fred had lost a house, but he had found himself. The narrator's voice echoed in the silent space, a closing affirmation for Fred's journey. Self-respect is the most precious gift we can give ourselves, and at any age, it is never too late to find yourself. This line wasn't just for Fred, but for all of us. His story serves as a reminder that it is never too late to change. No matter how many years have passed, no matter how many mistakes we've made, we can always find ourselves again and rebuild our lives from what's been lost. And when we find ourselves, when we learn to love and respect ourselves, everything becomes easier. Fred, in this moment, was no longer the man who had lost everything, but the man who had found freedom, found himself. The last words of the story came softly, like a farewell, a reminder of a journey full of meaning. And at any age, it is never too late to find yourself. Fred closed his eyes and smiled, letting the wind blow through his hair, letting the peace envelop his soul. He had found the most valuable thing in his life, and that was himself. In Fred's journey, we not only witness loss, but also the process of healing. He has gone through pain and the shocks that life has given him, but he did not let them consume his soul. And from the darkness of meaningless sacrifice, Fred found the light of self-respect. His final decision was not about revenge, but about saving himself. Even though the house is gone, and the love from his daughter may have faded, Fred understood that nothing is more important than maintaining self-respect. His steps along the lakeside path are a testament to that. A person, no matter how much they lose, can still stand up, find themselves again, and continue life with strength. So, if you find yourself in a difficult place, if you feel like you've lost everything, remember that it is never too late to find yourself. Sometimes, we need to go through great challenges to realize our true value. And just like Fred, when you learn to love yourself, you will find the strength to change, to stand up, no matter your age. Share this story if it touches your heart, or if you're on your own journey of reclaiming the self-respect you've lost. Have you ever faced similar challenges? How did you regain your strength after loss? Comment below. Share your thoughts, so we can heal together and continue walking the path of rediscovering ourselves.